Most people say a midlife crisis begins quietly, a restless thought, a wish you can't explain, but mine arrived like a cold wind through an open window, carrying the scent of everything I tried to forget. I didn't know then that the unraveling of my old life was the only way my second one could begin. For 23 years, I lived in a pleasant, predictable neighborhood on the edge of town, the kind with trimmed hedges, whispering fences, and polite smiles that never touched the eyes. My name is Marianne, and for most of my life, I believed comfort was enough. I told myself that routine was safety, that silence was peace. But sometime after my 45th birthday, the quiet in my house changed. It pressed into the walls, into the corners, into the spaces between dinner conversations. It settled on my shoulders like a secret waiting to be acknowledged. And when I finally stepped outside that world, it wasn't rebellion they saw in me, it was crisis. They had no idea what was really waking up. If stories like this feel close to your own heart, you're welcome to subscribe. Sometimes we find ourselves together in the quiet. I remember the color of the kitchen first, the pale yellow walls glowing to warm against the dim evening outside. It was the kind of light that made everything look softer, but somehow it only made me feel more exposed. The dishwasher hummed in the background, steady and cold, like a machine that knew its purpose even when I didn't know mine. My birthday cake sat on the counter, half sliced, half forgotten, its candles tilted at tired angles. I stood alone in the doorway, listening to the floor creak beneath me, as if it remembered a version of me I no longer recognized. When I placed my hand on the counter, the marble felt cooler than it should have, and I realized my body felt warmer than it used to, like I was standing too close to a fire I couldn't see. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe but sinks. I could still hear the echo of polite laughter from earlier, the kind you give out of obligation rather than joy. My husband had wished me a happy birthday, with a distracted smile, his eyes drifting back to the glow of his phone before his lips even finished forming the words. The children left the table one by one, plates barely scraped clean, the scrape of chairs pushing back sounding like the final note of a song no one really enjoyed. For a moment, I watched them all retreat, their silhouettes moving down the hallway like shadows pulling away from the light. When the last door clicked shut, I found myself alone with half-warm food, half-melted frosting, and a growing sense of distance inside my own home. The silence settled around me as I cleared the plates. I moved slowly, not out of exhaustion, but because I didn't know what else to do. The dishwasher door opened with a soft groan, and I set each plate inside carefully, as though thoughtfulness might redeem the evening. I leaned against the counter and waited for something, a spark of gratitude, a wave of melancholy, even a flicker of frustration, but there was nothing, just a hollow pause, like someone had pressed mute on my emotions. The dishwasher began its cycle, humming with a certainty I couldn't mimic. I stared at the machine and wondered when my life had become background noise. When I had stopped noticing the little things that used to warm me, when I had stopped noticing myself. The candles caught my eye. Their wax had pulled into uneven puddles down the side of the cake, giving it a lopsided, weary appearance. I picked one up between my fingers, feeling the hardened wax flake slightly. It looked tired. I felt tired. The parallel was almost too on the nose. With a quiet breath, I scraped the remnants of the frosting into the trash. Each swipe of the spatula felt strangely symbolic, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Something inside me stirred, faint, like the flutter of a small bird trying to lift itself from deep inside the chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't sadness. It was more like recognition. Like the first whisper of a truth I had ignored, I walked to the sink and let the water run over my hands. The warmth slipped across my skin, softening the chill I hadn't realized had settled over me. I looked at my reflection in the dark window above the sink, just the faint outline of my face, blurred by the night outside. I studied it carefully. The woman staring back looked familiar but distant, like an acquaintance I kept meaning to catch up with but never found the time. I tilted my head slightly, watching the outline follow. I tried to imagine what she would say if she could speak. Would she ask why I stayed so small for so long? Would she wonder when I stopped asking myself what I wanted? A soft thud echoed from somewhere down the hallway, probably a door settling into its frame, nothing more, but it made me flinch. The house didn't usually feel this loud, or maybe I was simply hearing it differently tonight. I dried my hands on a towel and let out a breath I didn't remember holding. I walked back to the dining room, scanning the table where the celebration had taken place just an hour before. The chairs were slightly askew, the tablecloth wrinkled near the edge, the cake knife still lying beside the empty plates. It all looked like the aftermath of an event no one fully participated in. I thought back to earlier in the day, trying to pinpoint the moment where the disconnect began. Breakfast had been rushed. Conversation had been thin. There were no birthday cards, no simple surprises, no lingering hugs. Just a calendar date to be acknowledged and then moved past. I wondered when birthdays stopped meaning something to me, or if they ever truly had as an adult. I wondered if I had accepted this routine not because it satisfied me, but because I was too tired to question it. And beneath those questions lay a deeper one. When had I last felt alive in my own life? The hum of the dishwasher grew louder, or maybe the rest of the house grew quieter. I sank into one of the dining chairs, feeling the wooden frame press into my back. I let my fingertips trace the grain of the table, the same one where countless meals had been eaten, countless birthdays celebrated, countless silences endured. I listened to the soft tick of the wall clock above the doorway. Time moved, steady and indifferent, even when I felt stuck. I closed my eyes and allowed the quiet to settle. But this quiet felt different from the quiet earlier. It didn't feel like a wait. It felt like a gap, an opening. When I opened my eyes again, the room looked the same, but I didn't feel entirely the same. It was subtle, barely noticeable, like the difference between dusk and night. But it was there. A shift, a pull, a stirring. I stood up and walked toward the window, staring at the street outside. The houses across from mine glowed softly in the evening light. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A car door closed gently 2 houses down. Life was still happening. The world was still moving. And somewhere inside me, something small began to move too. I turned off the kitchen light and let the darker room settle around me. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I stepped away, and it felt like a quiet acknowledgement, like the house wasn't used to me wandering at this hour. I paused in the hallway, listening to the faint murmur of my husband's television show filtering through the bedroom door and the soft tapping of my daughter's keyboard from down the hall. Their lives continued without interruption. Mine, however, had found a fracture. I touched the wall lightly as I walked toward the stairs, feeling the subtle texture beneath my palm. It felt grounding, like something to hold onto, but part of me wondered what it would be like to let go instead. The thought wasn't frightening, it felt curious, gentle, almost hopeful. I reached the top of the stairs and hesitated, listening to the house breathe around me. Could this numbness be the beginning of something, rather than the end? I didn't plan to go out there that morning. The day had started like any other, quiet, slow, the house holding its breath in that way it often did after breakfast. But something pulled me toward the back door, a soft tug somewhere behind my ribs. The autumn air met me with a cool greeting, smelling faintly of dry leaves and old wood. I stood at the foot of the garage stairs, looking up at the narrow wooden steps that led to the storage room. Dust clung to the small window at the top, filtering the sunlight into a pale haze. The floorboard near the bottom creaked beneath my weight, like it remembered me, and wasn't sure how to feel about it. I placed my hand on the railing, surprised by how cold it felt, and began to climb. By the time I reached the top, I was breathing harder than I expected. The door stuck slightly when I pushed, as though it had grown accustomed to being left alone. When it finally gave way, a soft wave of dust drifted up, glowing in the thin strip of morning light. The room smelled of cardboard, forgotten summers, and the faint sweetness of old paper. I stepped inside, feeling the uneven floor shift gently under my feet. Boxes were stacked along the far wall, some labeled in my old handwriting, others blank. Cobwebs clung to the corners like delicate curtains. For a moment, I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust, letting the quiet settle around me. It felt different from the silence of the house, less heavy, more curious, like the room was waiting for something. I knelt beside the closest box, my knees protesting slightly, and peeled the brittle tape away. Inside, I found an old set of acrylic paints, each tube squeezed and crumpled, colors hardened at the edges. A palette stained with long-dried streaks of blue and ochre. A journal with a soft leather cover, its surface worn smooth from another life. I lifted each item carefully, feeling the dust gather on my fingers. There was a tenderness in holding them, like touching memories I had intentionally misplaced. I found a pair of hiking boots tucked beneath a stack of canvas sheets, their soles cracked but still carrying the imprint of trails I vaguely remembered. Each object felt like a small accusation, a whisper saying, "You used to be someone who moved, someone who created, someone who looked outward as much as inward." I sat down on the floor, crossing my legs the way I used to when the kids were small and wanted to color beside me. The wood felt cool beneath me. I opened the journal slowly, expecting blank pages or hurried notes. Instead, I found sketches, faces, trees, windows, scenes, patterns I couldn't recall drawing. Some were delicate and careful, others were bold and messy, filled with strokes that seemed to spill out in impatience. I traced the lines with my fingertips, trying to summon the version of myself who had once held this pencil with such certainty. But the memories came only as fragments: a summer afternoon on the porch, a rainy evening by the living room window, a moment when the world felt wide and possible. The quiet surrounded me in a way that didn't feel isolating. It felt expectant, as if the room was gently offering me something I had left behind. I leaned back on my hands and let my gaze wander across the boxes. There were more journals, more canvases, more little pieces of a life I used to imagine I would grow into rather than grow away from. I reached for another box and opened it to find colored pencils arranged in a tin, still vibrant despite the years. Beneath them lay old Polaroids of trips we never finished, places we promised to return to but never did. In one of them, I stood by a river holding those same hiking boots, smiling with a fullness I hadn't felt in years. The woman in the photograph looked sure of herself in a way that startled me. A soft gust of wind rattled the single window, and the light shifted across the floor. It illuminated a small canvas propped against the wall. I pulled it closer and stared at the half-finished painting, just a sweep of color and the outline of a tree. I studied the brush strokes, wondering what I had meant to add, what I had meant to say. It struck me that I used to begin things without knowing how they would end. I used to trust that the rest would come. Sitting there, holding that incomplete canvas, I felt a pang of something sharp and tender. It wasn't regret. It was something more like longing for the version of me who wasn't afraid of beginnings. I placed the canvas gently on my lap and leaned back against a stack of boxes. Dust settled around me like soft fog. The room felt warm in a way the house hadn't felt in years. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time I had come here. It must have been over a decade ago, back when the kids still left toys everywhere and I still had a habit of losing track of time while painting. I could almost hear their young voices calling up the stairs, asking if they could help, smearing their fingers with paint, laughing when they made a mess. Those memories came with a sweetness that made my throat tighten. I opened my eyes and breathed in, letting the air fill my lungs slowly. I didn't know what I was searching for when I climbed those stairs, but now, sitting on the floor surrounded by pieces of a younger self, I understood the pull. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't grief. It was recognition, quiet, patient recognition. This room held a version of me I had quietly abandoned for the sake of predictability. I had boxed up every part of myself that didn't fit neatly into being a wife, a mother, a dependable presence. And those parts had waited, silently, expectantly. The boards creaked as I shifted to stand, the sound soft and familiar. I looked around the room one more time, feeling something settle inside my chest, not a resolution, not yet, but an opening, a widening, a reminder that there were still pieces of me untouched by all the years that had passed. I brushed dust from my hands and let out a slow breath. What other parts of myself had I left boxed up? I found the notebook by accident, though part of me wonders now if anything about that morning was accidental. The light coming through the small garage window had shifted just enough to illuminate a corner I hadn't looked at earlier. The notebook lay there, tucked beneath a stack of faded sketchbooks, its leather cover soft with age and dust settling in its creases like quiet punctuation marks. When I picked it up, the weight of it felt strangely familiar, like holding an old thought I once meant to finish. I brushed off a layer of dust and flipped it open, expecting blank pages or half-formed sketches. Instead, a folded sheet of paper slid into my lap, its edges yellowed, its folds worn thin from time. I stared at the paper for a long moment before unfolding it. My hands felt oddly warm against its age-cooled texture. The handwriting on the page hit me immediately: smooth, rounded letters, full of youthful certainty I could hardly imagine anymore. It was my handwriting, but younger, softer, unburdened. I sank onto the floor near the small window that overlooked the driveway, letting the pale morning light fall across the page. The ink had faded slightly, but every word was still legible. To myself at 25, the letter began. My breath caught, a thin, fragile thing suspended in the still air. I pressed the paper between my fingers and began to read. The words pulled me back to a time when life felt like an open road rather than a narrow hallway. My younger self wrote about the life she hoped to build, one filled with art, with travel, with moments of meaning rather than routine. She wrote about not wanting to lose her curiosity, about wanting to remain brave enough to choose herself even when it felt inconvenient. She wrote about dreams I had once carried so close to my chest that they felt like heartbeat echoes. As I read, a warmth gathered in my throat, equal parts grief and tenderness. The woman who wrote these words believed in possibility. She believed in me. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped believing in her. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and leaned my head against the wall. The wood felt cool, grounding. Outside the window, the driveway sat quiet, the concrete cracked in familiar lines. The world looked exactly as it had yesterday, yet somehow completely altered by the presence of this letter. I read it again, slower this time, lingering on certain phrases. Don't settle. Remember your hands were made to create. Don't let the world quiet your voice. The younger version of me had written with a confidence that bordered on naive. But I found myself envying her, envying the clarity, envying the sense of direction I had once claimed without hesitation. The letter spoke of choices I meant to revisit, starting my own art studio, taking a road trip across the coast, going back to school even if it meant starting later than others. I felt a faint ache bloom in my chest as I realized how many of those choices I had pushed off in favor of practicality. Life had become a series of tasks to complete rather than a landscape to explore. I wondered when being responsible began to feel like being trapped. I wondered when I stopped giving myself permission to want anything more than stability. A soft breeze pushed against the window pane, carrying with it the scent of dry leaves and the faint noise of a neighbor's car door closing. The world outside continued in its steady rhythm. Unaware of the shift happening inside me, I folded the letter carefully and set it on my lap, resting my palms on either side of it. My younger self had written these words out of hope, not expectation. She couldn't have known all the turns my life would take. She couldn't have known the ways I would stretch myself thin to support others, or how small I would allow my own needs to become. But she also couldn't have known that her voice would echo back to me decades later, waking something that had gone quiet. I lifted the letter again and traced the final line with my fingertip. If you ever forget who you dreamed of becoming, come back to these words. It felt like a whisper across time, soft but insistent. I let the words sink in, letting them settle into the parts of me that still felt porous and unsure. It startled me how easily they slipped past my defenses, how deeply they landed. I closed my eyes and imagined my 25-year-old self sitting across from me, bright-eyed, hopeful, perhaps slightly reckless but wholly alive. Would she recognize the woman I had become? Would she be disappointed? Or would she offer me grace I struggled to give myself? When I opened my eyes, the room felt subtly different. The dust still drifted lazily through the air. The boards still creaked faintly with each shift of my weight, but something in the atmosphere had changed. It didn't feel stagnant. It felt patient, inviting. The quiet held me gently, as if urging me to keep listening. I held the letter against my chest and let my head rest back against the wall. The wood warmed slightly beneath me, or maybe I warmed against it. I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that something inside me, something dormant, stirred again. I rose slowly from the floor, careful not to tear the fragile paper still clutched in my hand. The window light caught the surface of the letter, making the faded ink glow softly. I walked toward the small table near the door and set the letter down on it, smoothing the creases thoughtfully. I wasn't ready to put it back in the box. I wasn't ready to close the notebook either. These pieces of my younger self demanded attention, demanded space. I let my fingers hover above the journal one last time before stepping back. As I reached for the doorknob, a question lingered at the edge of my mind, soft, persistent, impossible to ignore. Is it too late to start listening now? It started with the light, the kind of dusk light that slips in quietly, softening the edges of everything it touches. I remember standing by the living room window one evening, watching the sky turn lavender and gold, and feeling something inside me loosen. The colors looked unfamiliar, though I must have seen them thousands of times before. They stretched across the sky like a slow exhale, inviting and patient. When I stepped outside, the air greeted me with a coolness that brushed against my cheeks. The porch steps creaked underfoot, their sound sharp in the quiet. I hesitated at the end of the walkway, as if stepping onto the sidewalk required permission. But then the breeze lifted the hem of my shirt gently forward, and I followed it. The neighborhood felt different at this hour, softer. The day's sounds dissolved into a gentle hum, distant laughter, a dog barking to houses down, the faint hum of someone's television carried across open windows. My footsteps were almost soundless against the pavement. It struck me how long it had been since I walked for no reason other than to move. I didn't bring my phone. I didn't bring a purpose. I only brought myself, and for the first time in a long while that felt like enough. The streetlights flickered on one by one, halos forming around their soft glow. With each step, the weight on my shoulders shifted, lightened. rearranged. As I passed the Hendersons' house, I heard the muffled rise of voices, nothing alarming, just the familiar sound of two people disagreeing about something mundane. The curtains were drawn, but the shadows behind them moved like a play I wasn't meant to watch. I felt strangely detached, present but unseen, as if I had slipped into some quiet layer of the evening where the rules of daily life didn't quite apply. Further down the street, a family laughed at something on their porch. The father's voice boomed cheerfully. The mother's laugh followed, warm and round. Their moment of joy drifted toward me, softened by distance. I smiled without meaning to, though the smile felt unfamiliar, like a borrowed expression I was trying on. The sky deepened as I walked, the lavender melting into dusky blue. A handful of stars blinked awake overhead. The homes I passed blended into one another, painted doors, tidy lawns, bicycles leaning against fences. It all felt like a world I belonged to but didn't fully inhabit. I realized how many evenings I had spent inside, letting the hours slip by unnoticed. This small act, stepping outside, felt almost rebellious. Not dramatic, not wild, just a quiet refusal to remain still. My breath came in slow, steady pulls, each one clearing a little more space inside my chest. I reached the end of our street and paused. The familiar route would take me around the block and back toward home, predictable and safe. But something tugged at me, a gentle pull toward the left, down a street I'd rarely bothered to explore. The sky cast a golden shimmer across the pavement, like a path waiting to be walked. I followed it, curiosity humming softly beneath my ribs. The houses on this street looked different, older, with wider porches and trees that stretched their arms across the road. A cat darted beneath a parked car, pausing to watch me with glowing eyes before disappearing into the shadows. The air smelled faintly of someone's dinner, garlic, rosemary, something simmering on a stove. It made me think of the meals I used to cook with enthusiasm, back before repetition dulled the joy of it. My feet carried me forward, each step landing with quiet confidence. A pair of wind chimes tinkled lazily in the breeze, their sound delicate and soothing. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the breeze brush against my face. The world felt big in a way I hadn't let myself feel in years. As I wandered further, I reached a cul-de-sac I didn't recognize. A street lamp stood at its center, casting a gentle glow onto the circle of pavement below. I walked beneath it and looked up at the sky. The last streaks of gold faded slowly into the horizon, leaving behind a deep, velvety blue. The stillness of the street wrapped around me, not isolating but inviting. I stood there long enough to feel my breath fall into rhythm with the quiet night. I wondered how many evenings I had spent rushing through chores, through conversations, through routines that left no room for wonder. I wondered when I had stopped noticing beauty that asked nothing of me. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, pulling me gently back to the present. I turned and began walking again, not entirely sure where the path would lead. The streets curved in ways I didn't expect, small turns revealing pockets of the neighborhood I had never taken the time to see. A house with a garden full of lanterns, a cracked walkway lined with blooming roses, a porch swaying slowly though no one sat in it. Each detail felt like an invitation, quiet, unassuming, but persistent. By the time I realized how far I'd wandered, the sky had shifted into full night. The moon hung low, pale and steady, illuminating the edges of rooftops. I felt a strange comfort in being out here, walking roads that weren't part of my routine. I felt unobserved and yet more seen than I had in years. Maybe by the sky, maybe by myself. I wasn't sure, but the quiet inside me no longer felt heavy. It felt spacious. I stopped at a crosswalk and let my gaze drift across the street. The houses here were unfamiliar, their windows glowing softly from within. I imagined the lives happening inside, meals being shared, arguments unfolding, children preparing for bed. I didn't feel envy. I didn't feel sadness. I felt possibility. A soft, steady possibility that whispered, "There's more than this. You're allowed to want more than this." It startled me how comforting that whisper felt. My steps eventually turned me back toward home, though not through any conscious decision. The night air settled cool against my skin as I retraced paths I didn't know I'd taken. When my house finally came into view, its porch light glowing dimly, I paused at the end of the walkway. The sight of it felt different, not bitter, not familiar, just small. The place I returned to, but not necessarily the place where all of me lived. I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet of the evening wrap itself around me. The sky above shimmered faintly with stars, patient and distant. I exhaled slowly and stepped back onto the porch. The floor creaked like it remembered me. I touched the doorknob, cold beneath my fingers, and paused. I found the cafe by accident, though perhaps accident isn't the right word. My feet had taken to wandering these days, turning down streets I didn't know until something inside me loosened. That morning, the cold air carried the faint smell of roasted beans, warm and earthy. It drifted between the storefronts like a soft invitation. The cafe sat on a corner I rarely passed, small and unassuming, its windows fogged at the edges. A bell chimed as I stepped inside, the gentle sound settling into the quiet space. A handful of people sat scattered around, bent over laptops or books. I clutched the sketchbook tucked under my arm, not intending to use it, only feeling the need to keep it close. The warmth inside touched my face first, then melted into my hands as I rubbed them together. I stepped toward the counter and felt the subtle shift of comfort, the quiet kind you don't realize you've been missing until it greets you. The man behind the counter looked up as I approached. He had a soft expression, the kind that didn't demand anything from you. His name tag read Ellis, though his demeanor said more than his name did. He offered a small smile, gentle, unhurried. "What can I get for you?" he asked, his voice warm in a way that surprised me. I ordered a simple coffee, something easy, something I wouldn't have to think about. As he prepared it, his eyes drifted to the sketchbook at my side. "Do you draw?" he asked, not with curiosity that pried, but curiosity that welcomed. I hesitated, my fingers tightening slightly around the book. No one at home ever asked, no one ever seemed to remember that I once did. "I used to," I answered quietly. The words felt like they were waking up after a long sleep. He nodded thoughtfully, as though that answer meant something. "It's nice to carry something familiar with you," he said, setting the cup on the counter. His tone was gentle, sincere. I thanked him and reached for the cup, feeling its warmth seep into my palm. Ellis didn't push the conversation further. He simply offered a smile that reached his eyes, a small spark of kindness that didn't ask for anything in return. I found myself lingering a moment longer than necessary, the silence between us feeling calm rather than awkward. When I finally stepped away, the bell above the door chimed softly behind me. Outside, the cold air returned, but somehow it felt less sharp. I walked down the street sipping the coffee, its warmth unfurling through me slowly. The sketchbook felt lighter in my hands, as though it had been acknowledged for the first time in years. I kept replaying his question, "Do you draw?" and the way he had asked it, as though the answer mattered, as though I mattered. When I reached the corner, I stopped without meaning to and looked back at the cafe's fogged windows. The moment had been small, fleeting, barely more than a handful of words exchanged. Yet I felt a strange fullness in my chest, delicate but unmistakable. I took another sip and let the warmth settle. The next morning, before my mind could begin its usual litany of reasons to stay home, my feet were already moving toward the cafe. I told myself it was the coffee, the cold weather, the need for a walk, but somewhere underneath those excuses, I knew the truth carried a different shape. When I stepped inside, the bell chimed again, and Ellis looked up from wiping the counter. His smile flickered into place easily, naturally. "Good morning," he said, and the words sounded like they held more weight than simple politeness. I ordered the same thing, though this time my voice didn't feel like it was tiptoeing. As he handed me the cup, his eyes paused briefly on the sketchbook again. "Did you get a chance to draw yesterday?" he asked softly. I opened my mouth, closed it, then shook my head. "Not yet," I said, "but I thought about it." The corner of his mouth lifted, not in amusement but in quiet understanding. "Thinking about it is a start," he replied. Something warm settled under my ribs. I didn't linger this time. I didn't need to. The acknowledgement alone had done something I couldn't quite explain. I walked away from the cafe holding the cup in both hands, letting the warmth bleed into my fingers. The wind brushed past me gently, carrying the faint scent of winter. I felt a smile slipping onto my face, small, unforced, honest. It wasn't the polite smile I used at home when someone asked about my day, the one that felt like a reflex rather than a feeling. This was different. This was something opening, something rising slowly, cautiously, like a flower turning toward light it hadn't felt in seasons. As I reached the end of the street, I paused and pressed my free hand lightly against the sketchbook tucked under my arm. I hadn't thought about drawing in years, not really. But now, the idea didn't feel out of reach. It felt gently possible. I stood there beneath the gray sky, letting the moment settle into me, letting the quiet around me stretch into something calm. A question rose softly at the edges of my mind, not demanding answers, just offering curiosity. What else might awaken if I keep letting myself be visible? I noticed the change in the house before I noticed the change in him. It was subtle at first, the way the air seemed heavier in certain rooms, the way my footsteps sounded sharper on the tile. Even the walls felt like they held their breath when I walked past them. The evenings had begun to feel different too. I would return from my walks or my quiet trips to the cafe with a softness in my chest, a small warmth I didn't fully understand yet. But as soon as I stepped through the front door, that warmth cooled. The house met me with a familiar silence, but now it felt watchful, as though it sensed the shift before my husband did. The first night he questioned me was a Wednesday, I think, a forgettable weekday that somehow became memorable. I was late, returning home a few minutes only, but enough for him to look up from his phone with an expression that wasn't quite annoyance, but close. "Where are you?" he asked, though his eyes had already drifted back to the screen before the words finished leaving his mouth. I shrugged lightly, slipping off my shoes. "Just went for a walk." The response seemed to satisfy him on the surface, but something in the air tightened between us. Dinner was quiet that night. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that shapes itself into questions no one wants to ask. Over the next few days, the tension sharpened. He asked why I was wandering around so much lately, his tone more curious than accusatory, though edged with something else, something unsettled. The more time I spent out of the house, whether walking at dusk or visiting the little cafe, the more he seemed to notice. "Dinner's late," he remarked one evening, tapping his fork against the plate with a rhythm that grated. Another night he asked, "Everything okay with you?" But it wasn't concern that fueled the question. It was disruption, a crack in routine. I answered with a small smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, saying I was fine. But he didn't look at me long enough to see the truth or the lie. I began to notice his habits with a new clarity. The way he rushed through conversations, offering nods instead of presence. The way he scrolled through his phone during meals, his face illuminated by the glow of someone else's life. The way he sighed quietly, repeatedly whenever I paused too long before answering him. These were things he had always done, but now they felt heavier, more revealing. I saw them for what they were, small withdrawals, little cracks, not new ones, but ones I had chosen not to see until the rest of me began waking up. One evening, he asked, "Why are you always distracted lately?" The words weren't sharp, but the distance behind them was. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing truthful came out. How could I explain that I wasn't distracted? I was rediscovering myself, that the quiet inside me was shifting into something that didn't fit the shape of our marriage anymore. I gave him another soft shrug, another small deflection. It was easier than trying to explain something I didn't fully understand myself yet. Even the house seemed to react. The living room felt smaller, the kitchen colder, our bedroom felt like a room where I was visiting rather than living. I started waking earlier, sitting at the edge of the bed while the morning light crept across the wall. He slept through most of it, unaware of the quiet distance stretching wider between us. Some mornings, I traced the cracks in the ceiling with my eyes, wondering when they had formed and whether they were signs of something inevitable. The house, like the marriage, had settled over time, and now, both seemed tired of pretending they were solid. It was late one evening when I first went to the room above the garage instead of heading to the bedroom. I told him I needed to sort through old boxes, that I wanted to get rid of clutter. He nodded absently, barely looking up. His indifference stung in a way I hadn't expected. The kind of sting that doesn't cut immediately, but lingers, warm and aching beneath the skin. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the air shift as I reached the door. The room welcomed me with its quiet, expectant warmth. Dust hung in the air like soft snowfall, glowing faintly in the lamplight. The unfinished canvas still leaned against the wall. The journals lay open in small piles. It felt like stepping into a part of myself I didn't have to explain. I sat on the floor and listened to the muffled sounds of the house below his footsteps. The click of the remote, the hum of the TV, those sounds used to feel like home. Now they felt like distance. I lay back on the rug, staring at the wooden beams above me. The quiet here didn't judge or question. It simply existed. It held space. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but I did, wrapped in the warmth of old memories and the newness of undiscovered ones. When I returned to the house, hours later, he looked up briefly. "You were out there a long time," he said. His tone was neutral, but something flickered behind it. "Confusion, maybe, discomfort, just sorting through things," I answered. My voice felt steady, even though the truth wavered beneath it. He nodded again, but this time his gaze lingered just a bit too long, as though searching for something in my face he no longer recognized. The next night, I returned to the garage room again, and the night after that, I found myself drawn to it not as an escape, but as a place where I didn't feel small. I told myself I was organizing, clearing out boxes, deciding what to keep. But the truth was simpler. The truth was that the room felt honest. It felt like a mirror that reflected me back to myself without distortion some nights. As I lay on the rug or sat by the small window, I caught myself wondering when the gap between my inner life and the life inside the house had grown so wide. When we had stopped asking each other real questions. When I had begun shrinking my needs into the corners of our routine. And now, with every evening that passed, it became harder to hide behind excuses. What happens when the truth can no longer hide in excuses? The morning light crept in quietly, slipping through the thin gap in the curtains and stretching across the bedroom floor like a pale ribbon. I hadn't slept well. My body felt heavy, my thoughts scattered in the way they often did after a night spent in the room above the garage. When I finally rose, the floorboards pressed cool beneath my feet, steadying me with each careful step. I made my way to the bathroom, the house still wrapped in early silence. As I flicked on the light, the mirror startled me not with harshness, but with clarity. My reflection stared back, unfamiliar yet undeniably mine. There was a spark in my eyes I hadn't seen in years, small but unmistakable, like the first ember of a long dormant fire. I leaned in, studying it, unsure whether to trust what I saw. For a moment, I simply stood there, watching myself breathe. My hair fell differently now, a little softer around the face. The faint lines at the edges of my eyes seemed less like burdens and more like stories. I lifted my hand and touched my cheek lightly, tracing the curve of my jaw as though meeting a stranger who felt uncannily familiar. The woman in the mirror didn't look younger, didn't look transformed, but she did look awake. Awake in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in far too long. The realization made my chest tighten and loosen all at once, the way a held breath releases into something warm. I reached for the cabinet and took out a moisturizer I'd neglected for months. The cool cream spread across my skin, slow and patient. I didn't rush. I didn't scrub away at myself like a chore to be completed. Instead, I moved with a gentleness that surprised me. The next morning, before my mind could begin its usual litany of reasons to stay home, my feet were already moving toward the cafe. I told myself it was the coffee, the cold weather, the need for a walk. But somewhere underneath those excuses, I knew the truth carried a different shape. When I stepped inside, the bell chimed again, and Ellis looked up from wiping the counter. His smile flickered into place easily, naturally. "Good morning," he said, and the words sounded like they held more weight than simple politeness. I ordered the same thing, though this time my voice didn't feel like it was tiptoeing. As he handed me the cup, his eyes paused briefly on the sketchbook again. "Did you get a chance to draw yesterday?" he asked softly. I opened my mouth, closed it, then shook my head. "Not yet," I said, "but I thought about it." The corner of his mouth lifted, not in amusement but in quiet understanding. "Thinking about it is a start," he replied. Something warm settled under my ribs. I didn't linger this time. I didn't need to. The acknowledgement alone had done something I couldn't quite explain. I walked away from the cafe holding the cup in both hands, letting the warmth bleed into my fingers. The wind brushed past me gently, carrying the faint scent of winter. I felt a smile slipping onto my face, small, unforced, honest. It wasn't the polite smile I used at home when someone asked about my day. The one that felt like a reflex rather than a feeling. This was different. This was something opening, something rising slowly, cautiously, like a flower turning toward light it hadn't felt in seasons. As I reached the end of the street, I paused and pressed my free hand lightly against the sketchbook tucked under my arm. I hadn't thought about drawing in years, not really. But now, the idea didn't feel out of reach. It felt gently possible. I stood there beneath the gray sky, letting the moment settle into me, letting the quiet around me stretch into something calm. A question rose softly at the edges of my mind, not demanding answers, just offering curiosity. What else might awaken if I keep letting myself be visible? I noticed the change in the house before I noticed the change in him. It was subtle at first, the way the air seemed heavier in certain rooms, the way my footsteps sounded sharper on the tile. Even the walls felt like they held their breath when I walked past them. The evenings had begun to feel different too. I would return from my walks or my quiet trips to the cafe with a softness in my chest, a small warmth I didn't fully understand yet. But as soon as I stepped through the front door, that warmth cooled. The house met me with a familiar silence, but now it felt watchful, as though it sensed the shift before my husband did. The first night he questioned me was a Wednesday, I think, a forgettable weekday that somehow became memorable. I was late returning home a few minutes only, but enough for him to look up from his phone with an expression that wasn't quite annoyance, but close. "Where were you?" he asked, though his eyes had already drifted back to the screen before the words finished leaving his mouth. I shrugged lightly, slipping off my shoes. Just went for a walk. The response seemed to satisfy him on the surface, but something in the air tightened between us. Dinner was quiet that night. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that shapes itself into questions no one wants to ask. Over the next few days, the tension sharpened. He asked why I was wandering around so much lately, his tone more curious than accusatory, though edged with something else, something unsettled. The more time I spent out of the house, whether walking at dusk or visiting the little cafe, the more he seemed to notice. "Dinner's late," he remarked one evening, tapping his fork against the plate with a rhythm that grated. Another night he asked, "Everything okay with you?" But it wasn't concern that fueled the question. It was disruption, a crack in routine. I answered with a small smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, saying I was fine. But he didn't look at me long enough to see the truth or the lie. I began to notice his habits with a new clarity. The way he rushed through conversations, offering nods instead of presence. The way he scrolled through his phone during meals, his face illuminated by the glow of someone else's life. The way he sighed quietly, repeatedly whenever I paused too long before answering him. These were things he had always done, but now they felt heavier, more revealing. I saw them for what they were, small withdrawals. Little cracks, not new ones, but ones I had chosen not to see until the rest of me began waking up. One evening, he asked, "Why are you always distracted lately?" The words weren't sharp, but the distance behind them was. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing truthful came out. How could I explain that I wasn't distracted? I was rediscovering myself, that the quiet inside me was shifting into something that didn't fit the shape of our marriage anymore. I gave him another soft shrug, another small deflection. It was easier than trying to explain something I didn't fully understand myself yet. Even the house seemed to react. The living room felt smaller, the kitchen colder. Our bedroom felt like a room where I was visiting rather than living. I started waking earlier, sitting at the edge of the bed while the morning light crept across the wall. He slept through most of it, unaware of the quiet distance stretching wider between us. Some mornings, I traced the cracks in the ceiling with my eyes, wondering when they had formed and whether they were signs of something inevitable. The house, like the marriage, had settled over time, and now, both seemed tired of pretending they were solid. It was late one evening when I first went to the room above the garage instead of heading to the bedroom. I told him I needed to sort through old boxes, that I wanted to get rid of clutter. He nodded absently, barely looking up. His indifference stung in a way I hadn't expected. The kind of sting that doesn't cut immediately, but lingers, warm and aching beneath the skin. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the air shift as I reached the door. The room welcomed me with its quiet, expectant warmth. Dust hung in the air like soft snowfall, glowing faintly in the lamplight. The unfinished canvas still leaned against the wall. The journals lay open in small piles. It felt like stepping into a part of myself I didn't have to explain. I sat on the floor and listened to the muffled sounds of the house below his footsteps. The click of the remote, the hum of the TV, those sounds used to feel like home. Now they felt like distance. I lay back on the rug, staring at the wooden beams above me. The quiet here didn't judge or question. It simply existed. It held space. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but I did, wrapped in the warmth of old memories and the newness of undiscovered ones. When I returned to the house, hours later, he looked up briefly. "You were out there a long time," he said. His tone was neutral, but something flickered behind it. "Confusion, maybe, discomfort, just sorting through things," I answered. My voice felt steady, even though the truth wavered beneath it. He nodded again, but this time his gaze lingered just a bit too long, as though searching for something in my face he no longer recognized. The next night, I returned to the garage room again, and the night after that, I found myself drawn to it not as an escape, but as a place where I didn't feel small. I told myself I was organizing, clearing out boxes, deciding what to keep, but the truth was simpler. The truth was that the room felt honest. It felt like a mirror that reflected me back to myself without distortion. Some nights, as I lay on the rug or sat by the small window, I caught myself wondering when the gap between my inner life and the life inside the house had grown so wide, when we had stopped asking each other real questions, when I had begun shrinking my needs into the corners of our routine. And now, with every evening that passed, it became harder to hide behind excuses. What happens when the truth can no longer hide in excuses? The morning light crept in quietly, slipping through the thin gap in the curtains and stretching across the bedroom floor like a pale ribbon. I hadn't slept well. My body felt heavy, my thoughts scattered in the way they often did after a night spent in the room above the garage. When I finally rose, the floorboards pressed cool beneath my feet, steadying me with each careful step. I made my way to the bathroom, the house still wrapped in early silence. As I flicked on the light, the mirror startled me not with harshness, but with clarity. My reflection stared back, unfamiliar yet undeniably mine. There was a spark in my eyes I hadn't seen in years, small but unmistakable, like the first ember of a long-dormant fire. I leaned in, studying it, unsure whether to trust what I saw. For a moment, I simply stood there, watching myself breathe. My hair fell differently now, a little softer around the face. The faint lines at the edges of my eyes seemed less like burdens and more like stories. I lifted my hand and touched my cheek lightly, tracing the curve of my jaw as though meeting a stranger who felt uncannily familiar. The woman in the mirror didn't look younger, didn't look transformed, but she did look awake. Awake in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in far too long. The realization made my chest tighten and loosen all at once, the way a held breath releases into something warm. I reached for the cabinet and took out a moisturizer I'd neglected for months. The cool cream spread across my skin, slow and patient. I didn't rush. I didn't scrub away at myself like a chore to be completed. Instead, I moved with a gentleness that surprised me. It didn't feel like vanity. It felt like reverence, like tending to something that had been ignored. I combed through my hair, smoothing the strands with a tenderness I didn't know I was capable of giving myself. The mirror reflected each movement, each small gesture of care, transforming the simple act of getting ready into something ceremonial. By the time I stepped out of the bathroom, the house had begun to stir. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and uneven, signaling his entrance into the morning. I made my way to the kitchen to start the coffee. When he walked in, he paused briefly, his gaze catching on me longer than usual. There was a flicker, something between confusion and suspicion. "You're up early," he said, his voice groggy but tinged with something sharper. I shrugged lightly, pouring water into the kettle. "Just couldn't sleep," he kept observing me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You look different," he added, uncertain whether it was a compliment or an accusation. I didn't respond right away, letting the steam from the kettle rise between us. His attention lingered, longer than necessary, searching for something he couldn't identify. The silence stretched. He cleared his throat, breaking it with a forced chuckle. "Did you do something to your hair?" The question came out clipped, almost defensive. I shook my head gently. "No, just brushed it." He didn't seem convinced. He watched me as I poured my coffee, watched me as I reached for a mug with a steadiness that felt new. His stare was heavy, unsettling in a way that made my shoulders stiffen. He wasn't used to noticing me. He wasn't used to me noticing myself. As I sat at the table, the steam from the mug curled upward, soft and swirling. I lifted it to my lips, feeling the warmth spread through me. He sat across from me, tapping his fingers against the edge of his phone. I could feel him wanting to ask more questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. Instead, he settled on a neutral, "You've been distracted lately." The way he said it made it sound like a crime. I glanced up, meeting his eyes. "Maybe I'm just paying attention to different things now." The words came out quietly but firmly. His brow furrowed, but he didn't respond. The air between us shifted, carrying a tension I didn't try to soothe. Throughout the day, I noticed his subtle glances, little check-ins disguised as curiosity. When I walked past him in the hallway, he studied me with narrowed eyes. When I folded laundry, he lingered in the doorway longer than necessary. At dinner, he asked, "Is everything all right?" "You've changed." I kept my voice even. "I'm fine, just taking better care of myself." His fork paused midair. "Why now?" The question hung between us, sharp in its simplicity. I didn't have an answer that would satisfy him, so I didn't offer one. Later that night, I returned to the bathroom. The mirror greeted me with that same quiet reflection, steady and watchful. The spark in my eyes hadn't dimmed. If anything, it glowed more clearly beneath the soft bathroom light. I touched my face again, not out of doubt but out of recognition. I was rediscovering myself slowly, quietly, without permission. And the more I acknowledged the woman in the mirror, the more I realized how long I had gone without seeing her. As I left the bathroom, I found him standing near the bedroom doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked again, but this time his voice trembled with a hint of unease. I nodded. "I'm sure." He searched my face for clues, for signs of something he could label or dismiss. He drew in a breath, exhaled sharply, then muttered, "You're acting strange." The words stung, but they didn't wound. Not like they once would have. I stepped past him gently. "Maybe I'm just becoming myself again," I said softly. He didn't respond. He just watched me walk away, his silence louder than his suspicion. Back in the small room above the garage, I stood by the window and let the night air wash over me. The reflection in the glass was faint but still visible, a silhouette of a woman who no longer flinched from her own presence. The world outside was quiet, but inside me something hummed gently, persistently, like a truth that had waited long enough. Is self-discovery really something others must fear? The evening began quietly enough. The sun had already slipped below the rooftops, leaving the house wrapped in a muted, amber glow. I stood at the kitchen counter slicing vegetables, the steady rhythm of the knife a small comfort in the stillness. The overhead lights flickered once, then settled into their usual harsh brightness. They made everything look sharper, edges of counters, reflections on glass, even the small lines in my own hands. I could hear him moving around the living room, the distant rise and fall of the television filling the space between us. It was the sort of ordinary night we'd lived 1,000 times, but beneath the surface, something simmered. I felt it in the tightness of my shoulders, in the way my breath caught slightly when I heard his footsteps approaching. He entered the kitchen without a word, leaning against the counter opposite me. His eyes scanned me, the room, the half-prepared dinner. "You're late," he said finally, his voice low but edged. I didn't answer right away. I set the knife down gently and wiped my hands on a towel. "I went for a walk after the cafe," I said. "Lost track of time," he scoffed softly, crossing his arms. "You've been losing track of a lot lately." The way he said it, like an accusation wrapped in disappointment, made the back of my neck warm. I turned toward the stove, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been taking some time for myself. That's all." He pushed away from the counter abruptly. "For yourself?" he repeated, the words sharp enough to cut. "You're never home. Dinner's late. You're distracted. You barely talk to me." His voice rose with each sentence, building momentum like a storm. I felt a small tremor of something inside me, not fear, but a weary recognition. This confrontation had been waiting, gathering breath. I inhaled slowly, grounding myself in the smell of garlic and onions warming on the stove. "I'm still here," I said softly, "just changing." He shook his head, frustrated. "Changing into what?" I turned off the stove and faced him fully. The kitchen felt too bright, the lights humming loudly above us. The hum felt like static in my bones. "Into someone who's trying to reconnect with herself," I said. "Someone who's been quiet for too long." His eyes flashed with something sharp, anger, confusion, maybe both. "Quiet," he barked. "You think you're the only one who's tired? You think you're the only one who sacrifices?" His voice reverberated against the cabinets, making the room feel smaller. I stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but to create space for breath. "I'm not saying that," I replied calmly. "I'm saying I've felt invisible." The word hung between us, heavy, unfamiliar. He blinked, stunned for a moment, then scoffed again. "Invisible? Marianne, I've given you a good life. A stable home. What more could you possibly want?" His tone dripped with disbelief, as though the idea of my unhappiness was a personal insult. A good life. The phrase echoed in my mind, cold and hollow. I wrapped my arms around myself, not for protection but for steadiness. "Stability isn't the same as connection," I said. "I've been lonely for years. Even when we're in the same room, I feel alone." His jaw tightened. "So this is my fault now? You wandering around town, disappearing into that garage room, this is because of me?" His voice rose again, cracking at the edges. I felt my pulse quicken, not with panic but with a long overdue clarity. "You never asked how I felt," I said quietly. "You never noticed when I stopped smiling for real. You never wondered why I couldn't sleep, or why I cried in the shower some nights." The words came out steadier than I expected, decades of swallowed truth forming themselves at last. He stared at me as though seeing me for the first time, then shook his head slowly. "This isn't you," he said. "You're being dramatic. You're going through some phase." He waved his hand vaguely, dismissing my pain as though brushing away dust. Something inside me tightened, then snapped cleanly. I stepped closer, my voice lowering but gaining weight. "Don't call this a phase," I said. "Don't make my awakening into your inconvenience." His eyes widened slightly, not from fear, but from the shock of hearing a firmness he'd forgotten I possessed. The kitchen felt unbearably bright. I reached up and turned off the overhead light, leaving the room bathed in softer shadows from the stove and hallway. The dimness eased the sting behind my eyes. I leaned against the counter, letting the quiet stretch for a moment. He exhaled loudly, pacing once before stopping in front of me. "So what now?" he demanded. "You want to blow up our life because you're suddenly unhappy?" His voice cracked on the last word, revealing something raw beneath the anger, fear, maybe, or the realization that he had missed something important. I met his gaze steadily. "I don't want to blow anything up," I said. "I just can't keep shrinking myself to fit into the life we've built." I'm not abandoning everything. I'm asking you to see me." His eyes flickered, but he didn't answer. The silence that followed was thick, pressing into the corners of the kitchen like fog. It was heavier than the shouting, heavier than the tension. It was the silence of two people standing at a threshold neither knew how to cross. He finally stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you want from me," he murmured. "I don't know who you're becoming." I swallowed, feeling the truth rise like a tide. "I don't know either," I admitted. "But I know who I can't keep being." The words settled between us, soft yet unyielding. He looked away, his shoulders sagging not in surrender, but in confusion. The distance between us felt both familiar and suddenly insurmountable. I turned toward the stove again, though the dinner had already cooled. The smell of garlic and onions lingered, but the warmth of the moment had faded completely. I picked up the knife, then set it down again. My hands trembled just slightly. Staying, I realized, had begun to hurt in ways I could no longer ignore. What happens when staying hurts more than leaving? I didn't plan to leave that night. Not the way it happened, but something inside me had shifted after the argument, clicking into place with an unsettling certainty. The house felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls had moved in while I slept. When I opened my eyes that morning, the ceiling looked unfamiliar, washed in a gray light that made everything feel muted. I sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the stillness around me, the quiet thrum of the heater, the faint tapping of branches against the window. It was the kind of silence that demanded honesty. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, I knew I couldn't stay. Not like this. Not as this version of myself. I walked into the small room above the garage and stared at the scattered boxes, the journals, the half-finished painting. The air felt expectant, like it understood something was ending. I packed only what I could carry in a small overnight bag: a few clothes, my sketchbook, the letter from my younger self, and a toothbrush. Everything else felt too heavy, too tangled in history. The zipper caught for a moment before sliding shut with a soft hiss. I paused, letting my hand rest on the bag. My heart beat steadily, not racing, not thundering, just moving in a calm rhythm that surprised me. I expected panic. I expected guilt to claw at my ribs, insisting I turn back. Instead, I felt a quiet steadiness, thin but resilient. When I stepped out onto the driveway, the cool night air touched my skin like a promise. The porch light flickered above me, its glow stretched across the concrete in long, soft lines. I opened the car door and slid in, the seat cold against my back. As I started the engine, I glanced once at the house. The windows glowed faintly, familiar silhouettes moving behind the curtains. My chest tightened, not with regret, but with a kind of mourning for the version of me who had stayed out of obligation. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The sound felt final somehow. When I reached the end of the street, I waited at the stop sign longer than necessary, watching the neighborhood settle into its usual quiet. Then, with a slow breath, I turned toward town. The streets looked different at night when I wasn't rushing home. Street lamps cast soft circles of light onto the pavement. Storefronts glowed with warm yellow windows, the closed signs already flipped. A couple walked hand in hand past the bakery, their laughter floating gently through the air. The ordinary world felt unfamiliar in its calmness, as though I had stepped into a parallel version of my own life. I drove through town with the windows cracked slightly, the cool breeze brushing across my cheekbone. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, not out of fear, but from the strange sensation of choosing myself in real time. The rented room sat above an old print shop, its staircase winding up the side of the building. The landlord had handed me the key earlier that week, not knowing whether I'd ever use it. Just in case, I had told him. Now, standing at the foot of the stairs, I realized that just in case had quietly become now. I climbed slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. At the top, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. A small lamp sat on a wooden nightstand, casting a soft glow across the single bed and narrow window. It wasn't much, but it felt untouched by the expectations that had weighed on me for years. I set my bag on the floor and walked to the window. The town stretched before me in hushed blues and muted yellows. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sweeping across the street like slow-moving waves. I pressed my fingertips against the cool glass, letting the quiet settle. I waited for the guilt to arrive, to crash into me with the force I had always imagined it would. But it didn't. Instead, a gentle steadiness spread through my chest, unfamiliar, but real. It was the feeling of space, the feeling of breath. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered for a moment before I typed a short message to the kids. Asterisk I'm staying in town for a bit. I love you. We'll talk soon. Asterisk my thumb hesitated over the send button, but only for a heartbeat. Then the message disappeared into the quiet hum of the device. I placed the phone beside me and leaned back on my hands. The room was silent except for the muffled sounds of the city distant traffic. Someone's laughter on the street below. The low hum of a passing train. A question drifted through me. Soft as breath. Asterisk is freedom supposed to feel this quiet? Asterisk I let the thought settle. Maybe freedom wasn't loud. Maybe it wasn't a burst of exhilaration or a dramatic escape. Maybe it was this sitting alone in a small rented room, breathing steadily, feeling the weight of expectations slide gently off your shoulders. I lay back on the bed, the mattress dipping slightly beneath me. The ceiling above was plain, unremarkable, but it felt like a blank page unused, waiting, wide open. The night deepened. The moon climbed higher, its light slipping through the window and stretching across the floor. I closed my eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the room. I didn't know if this was temporary or permanent. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like, or the day after. But for the first time in years, uncertainty didn't feel like failure. It felt like possibility. I turned onto my side, pulling the thin blanket up to my chest. My breath settled into a slow rhythm, matching the steady pulse beneath my ribs. In the stillness, something inside me whispered, not loud, not demanding, just present. Asterisk you stepped out. You're allowed to keep going. Asterisk the room held me gently as I drifted toward sleep, wrapped in the quiet understanding that the first step out was also the first step in. The mornings in the rented room arrived softly, as though the light itself was trying not to disturb me. It slipped in through the thin curtains in pale strokes, painting the walls in muted gold. For the first few days, I simply watched how it moved, how it warmed the wooden floor, how it reached across the bed toward me like an invitation. There was a quietness here I wasn't used to, a stillness that didn't feel empty. I sat at the small table by the window each morning, hands wrapped around a mug of instant coffee, staring at the canvas I had leaned against the opposite wall. It was blank at first, stark and intimidating, but something in me softened each time I looked at it. Eventually, after enough mornings of silence, I picked up a brush. The first stroke was clumsy. Too much paint, not enough intention. It dragged across the canvas in a muddled streak of blue-green, uneven and unpredictable. I stared at it for a moment, unsure whether to wipe it away. Then I made another stroke, and another. Soon the canvas filled with messy colors, some bright, some muted, all layered in a kind of quiet chaos that mirrored the shifting landscape inside me. The paint dripped in places, pooled in others. Nothing about it was graceful, but my hand moved with a steadiness that felt honest. I didn't paint images or scenes. I painted how the room felt, how my chest felt when I breathed a little deeper, how my thoughts untangled themselves slowly in the quiet. By midday, my fingers were streaked with color, my palms smudged with glimmers of yellow and gray. I wiped them on an old cloth and stepped back to look at what I'd made. It wasn't beautiful, but it was true. It held the mess of transition, the tenderness of uncertainty. I touched the corner of the canvas lightly, feeling the texture beneath my fingertips. It had been so long since I let myself make anything without fear of judgment. The room held its breath around me, as though honoring the moment. In the afternoons, I found myself drifting toward the cafe more often. The bell above the door chimed its small welcome each time I entered. Ellis always seemed to notice me the moment I stepped inside, offering that same gentle smile that softened something deep within me. "Good to see you," he'd say, and he meant it. Our conversations were never long, never intense, just small exchanges about the weather, about books he was reading, about the shade of paint that lingered on the back of my hand. No labels, no obligations, just two people sharing moments in a quiet corner of the world. One afternoon, he handed me my drink and nodded toward the smudge of red paint on my wrist. "You've been busy," he said. I looked down at the stain and felt a shy warmth rise in my chest. "I've been trying," I replied. He didn't ask for details. He didn't pry. He simply smiled, soft, steady, and said, "Good." That one word carried more encouragement than anything I'd heard in years. I walked out of the cafe with the cup warming my hands and a sense of being gently seen, like sunlight filtered through leaves. The silence in my rented room became something I learned to sit inside. At first, it felt too large, too revealing. It forced me to hear things I had avoided for years: the tremble of my own breath, the steady hum of my thoughts, the loneliness I had carried quietly. But as the days passed, the silence softened. It became a companion rather than a weight. Each night, before bed, I returned to the canvas. Sometimes I added only a single stroke. Other times I painted until my arms ached. The painting grew stranger, more layered. It held streaks of color that made no sense together, and yet they belonged. One evening, as I dragged a wide brush across the surface in slow, thoughtful movements, I felt something loosen in my chest, a small release, subtle but deep. I set the brush down and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, my mind didn't race forward or backward. It simply settled. The dreams came a week later, at first soft, then vibrant. I saw colors I had forgotten: sunset pinks, ocean greens, the warm gold of summer afternoons. I dreamt of walking barefoot across fields, of standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the water, of painting late into the night with no fear of failure. I woke each morning with remnants of those colors lingering behind my eyes, tinting the world in hues that felt strangely familiar and deeply comforting. I lay in bed some mornings, letting those colors seep into me before the day began. One morning, after waking from a dream filled with deep indigo and sweeping strokes of white, I stood at the window of my rented room and watched the sun rise slowly over the rooftops. The light brightened the street below, touching parked cars, warming the tops of trees. I pressed my forehead lightly against the cool glass. The town moved quietly beneath me, unhurried and gentle. For the first time in years, I felt myself moving with it rather than against it. I wasn't healed. I wasn't finished. But I was returning to myself, to my imagination, to the woman who once believed in possibility. Each day was its own small reclamation, its own quiet victory. And in the hush of early morning, with color lingering on my fingertips and warmth settling into my bones, I wondered softly, could this be what beginning again truly looks like? The evening air carried a softness that settled into my skin as I walked toward the small restaurant on the corner. It had been months since I left the house, months of learning myself in quiet ways, months of painting, months of sitting with silence without flinching. Now, as I approached the warm glow spilling from the restaurant windows, my heartbeat pulsed with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. I had asked my children to meet me for dinner, unsure of what waited on the other side of that door. The sky behind the rooftops glowed a muted orange, soft and steady, as though offering reassurance. I stood outside for a moment, my hand resting on the cool metal handle. The hum of conversation drifted through the glass. I drew in a slow breath and stepped inside. The hostess guided me to a booth near the window. My children were already seated, their faces illuminated by the soft hanging lights. They looked up at me as I approached, older, quieter, carrying questions in the lines of their expressions. I slid into the booth, my hands folding neatly in my lap. They exchanged glances, the kind siblings share when something feels fragile. "Hi, Mom," my daughter said first, her voice tentative but warm. My son nodded, his gaze steady. "Hey." I felt a small tremor inside me, not fear but the weight of all the things unsaid. I offered a gentle smile, hoping it could bridge even a fraction of the distance time had created. The menus lay untouched for a moment as we settled into the quiet. The restaurant buzzed softly around us, clinking glasses, murmured conversations, the soft scrape of chairs against the floor. My daughter leaned her elbows on the table, studying me carefully. "You look different," she said. Her tone wasn't critical, just observant, honest. I nodded. "I feel different." My son shifted slightly, his brow furrowing. "Dad said you needed space," he said. The words floated between us, delicate as thread. He wasn't wrong, I replied softly. But it wasn't just space I needed, it was myself. Their eyes met again, a silent conversation passing between them. When they looked back at me, something in their expressions had softened. The server arrived, breaking the moment with casual questions about drinks and appetizers. Once he stepped away, the quiet returned, gentler now. My daughter reached across the table, resting her hand on mine. "Are you okay?" she asked, not accusatory, not fearful, just caring. I felt warmth bloom in my chest. "I'm learning how to be," I said. For a long time, I didn't realize how much of myself I'd set aside. My son leaned back, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "We just want you to be happy," he said. The simplicity of it caught me off guard. I nodded, swallowing gently. "I want that too." More than I ever let myself admit. I told them about the rented room, about the painting, about the long walks through town. I didn't speak with dramatic flourishes or apologies. Just clarity, truth. They listened quietly, absorbing each word. Not everything was easy to hear. I could see the flickers of confusion, the shadows of old expectations, but neither recoiled, neither accused. Their questions, when they came, opened rather than wounded. "Do you think you'll ever come back home?" my daughter asked softly. I let the question settle. The truth rose slowly within me, shaped by months of quiet rediscovery. "I don't know," I answered. "Not in the way things were, not in the shape I used to fit into." Her eyes glistened with something tender, understanding perhaps, or the beginnings of it. But we're still a family, I added. That hasn't changed. I'm just finding a different way to belong to myself, so I can show up for you without disappearing. Their faces softened, the tension easing from their features. My son exhaled long and slow. It's weird, he admitted. But I get it. Or I'm trying to, I smiled gently. That's enough. The server returned with our food, placing plates between us with practiced ease. The warmth of the dishes rose into the air, mingling with the glow of the restaurant lights. We began to eat, hesitant at first, then with growing comfort. Conversations stitched themselves together naturally, updates about school, small jokes, memories from years past that made us laugh quietly. As the meal went on, I felt that familiar heaviness in my chest begin to loosen. I hadn't known what to expect tonight, anger, confusion, blame, but instead, I found pockets of grace, openings, places where understanding could root itself gently. I watched my children speak, their faces animated under the warm lights. I felt the soft ache of love, steady and expansive. They were no longer the small hands that clung to me, they were young adults, capable of seeing me as a person rather than just a role. The thought filled me with something close to awe. When we finished dinner, we lingered for a while, reluctant to break the moment. The sky outside deepened into softer shades of orange and pink, settling into the quiet edge of twilight. I walked them to their car, the evening air cool against my arms. My daughter hugged me first, her embrace warm and certain. I'm proud of you, she whispered. The words landed softly but carried immense weight. My son hugged me next, holding on a little longer than usual. We'll figure this out, he said. I nodded, my throat tightening with emotion. We will. When their car pulled away, I remained on the sidewalk, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The sky above me glowed softly. A quiet promise stretched across the horizon. I breathed in the scent of night, cool air, faint traces of blooming jasmine from a nearby window box. The world felt open, endless, unhurried. For the first time in a very long time, I felt the full weight of a new beginning settle gently into my bones. Endings, I realized, were not failures. They were thresholds. When faced bravely, they left room for beginnings that once felt impossible. I looked down at my hands, steady now, no longer trembling from uncertainty. I belonged to myself, fully, finally. What might I create now that I finally belonged to myself?